Hello and welcome to another episode of the Psychosocial Distancing Podcast. I'm one of your hosts, Daniel Chadbourne, and with me is Thomas Brooks.
Hey.
So we're skipping special guests again this week and continuing our trek in Chapter 6, Conformity. We've talked about conformity in academia. We've talked about conformity in protest. And today, we might talk a little bit about protests, but we're also going to talk about conformity on the internet and some of the processes in which being anonymous online can affect our behavior in a number of ways. So I want to share a story with you.
Ooh, story time.
I've got an article this week. There are actually two. There's kind of an article and then a counter article that kind of says, well, you don't understand. And I really think that the counter article makes my case of what I want to talk about today a little better. So there's this concept. I know you're familiar with this, but there's a concept called deindividuation. It's a real fun word to say. It's not as fun to spell.
Oh, I'm sure.
But deindividuation focuses on this idea of kind of losing oneself in the crowd. And so there's research that shows individuals who are maybe a little more prudish or a little less outgoing will cut a rug on the dance floor. Will kind of get into it because they can't be readily identified. We also see cases with riots, especially post-sporting events, though alcohol is in some case, many cases involved in those. But for individuals who are kind of lost in the crowd or caught up in the crowd, they may find themselves engaging in some of these behaviors when they don't necessarily plan to. And so we have this situation where you can get lost. And the internet has created this kind of prime breeding ground for this effect. You are anonymous. You are legion. You are stuck as part of this larger group. And it increases the likelihood that you will follow the behaviors of the group or what you perceive to be the norms of the group in relation to this anonymity. This anonymity decreases individuation, individual sense of self, individual kind of sense of many aspects, morality, potentially, and can cause people to act out very differently. It was an argument a while back that we should have our names attached to our Twitter accounts because that would suddenly reduce death threats and other negative behaviors. Well, for the most part.
Would it do? Would it though? Would it do? Would it though?
I don't know. I mean, we just had an instance where representative back in my old neck of the woods just threatened on Twitter to shoot protesters. Yeah, this is a congressman. And so his name is definitely attached to his social media account. So I don't know. Maybe this would have been the case 5 years ago, but not so much. So this story takes us to Reddit, and not new Reddit, not modern Reddit. This is 2012 Reddit. This is
back when Reddit was a spicy world.
If you think Reddit's bad now, it in 2011, 2012, it was pretty bad. It was lawless. I mean, it was kind of like what if you don't know anything about old school Twitter, the people like James Gunn getting called out for tweets from like 2008. 2008 Twitter was pretty wild. It's, again, no rules. Most people acting really edgy. And there were some subreddits on Twitter. I mean, on Reddit in this case. Subreddits like "Are misogyny." "Are beating women." "Are jailbait."
Yikes.
And others. And there was a prominent poster. There's some others, and those are the three that I think I'm the most comfortable saying.
Right, because 2011 Reddit had some rough subreddits.
Yeah, I'm looking at some of these names here, and yeah, I'm not going to say those. We're gonna keep it as family-ish friendly as possible.
Yeah, that's my job to bring up our rating.
Right. So one of these people on Reddit who gained a certain level of infamy was a user by the name of Violent Acres. So Violent, ACREZ. So the cool kid's way of spelling acre. It had a Z to it. The Violent Acres was old school Redditor, was kind of around since the beginning. Old school when Reddit was still kind of old school. And eventually, kind of gained some level of moderator status, but was well known for posting on a lot of these subreddits. And, again, the level of seriousness to what he was posting is a whole nother thing. And that's kind of the argument to this counter argument that I'll post in the comments, is that, it's not meant to be taken seriously. He's a troll. Trolls are meant to upset people. They're meant to post stuff. Like, that's kind of their culture. They're meant to, we're not talking about Rick-rolling trolls. We're not talking about trolls, me and my friends used to have this kind of back and forth trolling game with each other. We had this kind of ugly looking smush face dog. And just occasionally we would just have it as an icon in the bottom of our computer. We're like, hey man, come and look at this real quick. And so you'd get them to look at the dog's face, and it's kind of like smush face and smiling. He's so ugly, he's cute. And that was, kind of the extent of our trolling behavior. Mm-hmm. No, this is, hey, why don't you look at this cute cat picture? And it's a gore pic. It's like a beheading video. Or I'm going to say something anti-Semitic, or I'm going to say something racist, because I know it's going to make people upset. It's going to rile them up. And I'm just in it for the lulz. I'm just in it because it makes me feel good to make other people upset. And so that's what he did. So he posted on a lot of these subreddits. He posted a lot of really questionable imagery, a lot of questionable pictures of girls, people underage, onto some of these subreddits, and honestly became a bit of a kind of trolly celebrity, well known amongst the community as this person who was constantly stirring the pot. And so, talking about it, this Gawker reporter, Adrian Chen, wrote this article, and he wrote it basically outing Violent Acres. Basically saying, this is who he is. This is his name. This is what he does for a living. He doxed him. I mean, he didn't give his address, but he laid it all on the line. He said, there's this guy who is using anonymity to spread such hateful messaging, to spread offensive, gross, disgusting things. Let's talk about trolls. And in the process of talking about trolls, let's throw it all on the line. Let's talk about this guy. And part of this interview, he actually goes and contacts him. He says, look, I'm Adrian Chen. I work for Gawker, and I'm writing this article, and I'm just going to give you a heads up, but I know you're Violent Acres, and I'm going to use your name in the article. And Chen kind of talks about how, in some interviews and things like that, talks about how, the situation that this guy was in, he's asked by there that he said that any of the content that he was responsible for, was it illegal? Chen said, well, not that he could tell, and he swears he would take down anything that was illegal, but it was always kind of pushing the line. So it was, I'm going to say something really offensive. I mean, you can drop shout the N-word from the rooftops. You can make anti-Semitic remarks. I mean, that's kind of part of your ability to communicate freely on the internet. And he would post some pictures and post stuff. And I mean, there's stuff on the internet if you look for it, but this was kind of all out there. But he kind of talks about how he goes and talks to, he talks to this guy and says, the guy does ask him, don't do it. I could lose my job. I could lose health insurance. My family can lose health insurance. And he's like, well, why didn't you think about any of this while you were doing it?
Right.
And it brings up this idea of deindividuation. The counter article, and I'll kind of read you this line from it as I'm jumping from article and article. basically says that like this is actually, proof of how ignorant the media is. It legitimizes digital lynch mobs, maybe an early form of cancel culture.
Mm-hmm.
But also argues that he's a troll. His stuff was downright, and this is a quote from the article, calling his transgressions vile isn't an overstatement. His stuff was downright disgusting. He had his hands in some of the most controversial subreddits, some of which I've named. And if you're
Mm-hmm.
offended by those titles, that's the point of a troll. His online behavior is so offensive that anyone that wants to be considered a respectable member of society has no choice but to oppose it.
Mm-hmm.
But on a platform where you're anonymous
Mm-hmm.
and there are other people doing this and they're getting upvotes for it and they're getting
Mm-hmm.
internet points and they're getting
Right.
a reaction like, oh, I made this person upset because they really thought I was being serious. At some point, it can become serious. I mean, you may not
Mm-hmm.
believe what you're saying, like deep down inside, but there's this effect that level of anonymity, and if the culture is like that, if that troll culture is like that, and you're a part of it, people give 4chan a bad rap. I mean, sections of 4chan are kind of deservedly so because that's the culture of that message board.
Mm-hmm.
It's that bad because everyone's anonymous.
Mm-hmm.
It's almost designed to be that bad, or at least the design can lead it to be that bad.
Right. This kind of makes me think of like I don't know if this particular troll would qualify in terms of like monetary compensation for all of the attention that he receives online, but something that this is a YouTuber, Peter often brings up all the time is that in the marketplace of ideas, that attention is currency because it often translates to monetary gains or upvotes or likes or follows. I know on Reddit there is a currency system on Reddit, isn't there?
Yeah, but
Gold.
you don't actually get money for that. Reddit gets money for that.
Mm-hmm.
And if you award someone these awards, they get like some additional features,
Mm-hmm.
and they Reddit gets some money.
Oh, okay.
That's kind of what it is. They don't receive any money. So on something like Reddit, this guy was not being paid for this. Or like people on
Mm-hmm.
4chan, they're not being paid for the stuff that they're posting, but they're getting reinforcement. So it's not a
Right. They're kind
monetary
of getting some like social prestige.
right.
So some cultural currency there. Which is also kind of like why you may or may not necessarily see these platforms getting rid of trolls if trolls bring in the gold.
Yes. Yes. Yeah. And especially when, I mean, YouTube has done a lot, I will say. I mean, there are a lot of problems on YouTube. But YouTube has done a lot in regards to some of the more unsavourable content.
Mm-hmm.
There's a lot of issues with probably still current issues, but definitely a lot of worse former issues with like kids YouTube.
Yes. Yeah.
And but yeah, that there are people on YouTube now who are basically turning outrage into clicks. I
Mm-hmm.
mean, there are some really famous names who have basically made their fame on getting people upset or ranting about stuff that you would think like, well, I don't have a problem with this, but they've gotten really good at working the algorithm. They're really good at thumbnails and titles, and they get you in, um, or they're dishing on some like really controversial details that, hey, maybe I'm interested. I mean, commentary YouTube is both
Full.
one of the most fascinating and one of the most horrible sides of YouTube,
Mm-hmm.
because there are a lot of people, I mean, who are doing more benign content, who are saying, hey, there's this problem, or hey, let's talk about this bad movie. But you also have the kind of other side that, spends 10 hours over 3 episodes arguing about, what, Brie Larson as Captain Marvel, or something like
Right.
that. And they're saying stuff, they're pushing the envelope, but they're also getting other people to talk about them. And so
Mm-hmm.
go and watch their
This
video. And
this makes me think of our current internet phenomenon, Mr. Ben Shapiro and his wet ass P word. Like he's getting dragged right now for his sexual behavior or lack thereof, but he's gotten a lot of attention.
yeah, it's part of that view that no, no press is bad press.
Right, exactly. Because if
That
we keep clicking and keep sharing, and his videos keep spreading, then that's going to be more people that watch more content and potential Patreons and ad revenue. Like,
and what's interesting about that is it does kind of break the de-individuation system, because the de-individuation system would say that someone like Ben Shapiro wouldn't necessarily maybe engage. But I would argue likely does, because he's a true supporter of what he's talking about and what he's
mhm.
getting into. Like we wouldn't
Or
go
at least he
face the
has institutional support.
that too. He's also got the power to say stuff like this. And you do have a lot
Mhm.
of these individuals online who they're under their name, which would kind of break that de-individuation side. They're putting their face out there. People know who they are. Um,
Mhm.
and I'm wondering if almost we would see that kind of maybe the monetary aspect is what's driving some of that. You know?
Yeah, I would see that you would, if someone doesn't have a lot of power on the internet, like, has an institution that supports them, that you would see more de-individuation going on. So kind of like mob rule on Twitter. But if you do have some power, then you no longer have to rely on that de-individuation to rack up that attention.
Yeah, and it does make me think there are a lot of personalities. I mean, across the spectrum who opt not to show their face.
Mm-hmm.
And again, that too is even if
Like
you're
us.
yeah, we could, but who would want to see that? Um, that yeah, but again, for a case like this, but we're still attaching our names to it,
Right.
and so you might have someone who isn't. But what you could see, and it doesn't necessarily have to be a bad thing, depending on what their kind of core side of YouTube is,
Mm-hmm.
what they're in it for, what the kind of values of the YouTube circle that they find themselves in. They may adopt those more, and so that also may mean that they're more willing to maybe push further in one direction, depending on that situation, because they're adopting more to the norms, or in some cases just that willingness to be able to express yourself more. I mean,
Mm-hmm.
that's a huge part of that de-individuation. If you suffer from some anxiety, or you're worried that, wait a second, what if someone finds out where I live, because I want to talk about controversial stuff.
Mm-hmm.
And instead, by doing so, you can kind of remove some of that worry from yourself through this the same process. It's kind of the opposite of that negative Reddit situation. If the environment is positive, de-individuation can lead to more positive behavior. But the flip side
Mm-hmm.
is what we see when we're talking about the internet. This also goes in, and I kind of move on to some of the other topics, but that there's a litany of research, and probably the most interesting regarding internet trolls and this kind of de-individualizing behavior on the internet comes out of the research, like on this particular topic. And so in the negative side of things, we go back to research in like the 30s and 40s that find that the size of a lynch mob, for instance, increases the likelihood of more intense severity. So more
Mm-hmm.
people involved, the worse it gets.
Right.
Um, I actually love it can be a very rough movie to get through, but I highly recommend. There's that one scene in Django Unchained
Mm.
where all the Klansmen are together and they're
Mm-hmm.
they're hooded up, and one guy's hood's not quite correct, and so he's trying to fix it. And so eventually he takes it off, and they're like, "Oh, come on! Like, you're not supposed to take the hood off. Like, now we
Right.
know who you are." And he's like, "Jim, like, we all know who we are."
Right.
But it kind of builds into that idea. It's a good example of like these de-individuating processes breaking down, where suddenly they're made aware, like, wait, I have to think that I'm actually doing this. I have to come to terms with the fact that I'm taking part of this lynch mob.
Mm-hmm.
Or the flip side of that, if you look at the end of To Kill a Mockingbird, when they start calling the people out on the front porch, the lynch mob shows up and they're like, you're the store owner, and you're this person, and you're the farmer down the road. And suddenly everyone's kind of looking at one another, and the mob
Right.
kind of
Kind of,
disperses.
yeah, it disperses the illusion.
And we see the same thing in anthropological research and psychology research, looking at face paint and masks. So Societies who go to war wearing masks or face paint are more likely to engage in more severe behavior towards their enemies or captives. For these same processes, you kind of lose yourself in the role that you're playing. And so what this can do for you on the internet is the several studies on trolling behavior. And they find that internet trolls, especially this, and again, you may not start as an internet troll. This is kind of a chicken or the egg situation.
Right.
Is that people who troll online, and again, not like rickrolling trolls, not, I'm messing with you in kind of a comedic way. It's benign, it's inoffensive, it's maybe a pun. We're talking about severe trolls. Here's some really disgusting stuff. They find that they tend to score high on all three aspects of the dark triad.
Oh, that would make sense.
Or if you include the new one, all four of the dark tetrad.
So the dark triad is narcissism, Machiavellianism, and psychopathy.
Yes.
What's the fourth one?
Sadism, taking pleasure in the pain of others.
Sadism. That makes sense.
Yeah, and so these individuals basically kind of tick off all the marks. They take pleasure in the pain of others, so other people get upset. They feel good about it.
Mm-hmm.
The psychopathy, there's no empathy, or at least there's a lack of empathy in what they do. So again, they're not kind of a true psychopath or true sociopath, but they take on those qualities when engaging in this behavior. They may go down the street. I mean, there was that time that like 4chan and the internet banded together and stopped that person who hurt the cat. Like, there's empathy out there, at least with animals.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, at least with animals.
But when it comes to kind of your, fellow Redditor, fellow 4chaner, maybe not. Yeah, and then the others with kind of Machiavellianism, so high in group favorability, high authoritarianism. You have to follow the rules, and the rules are I get to do this, and you can't fight back.
Mm-hmm. It's very manipulative. Like you understand the structure of where you're at and how to climb it.
Right, and on groups where you get the most attention and you get the most applause if you're the biggest troll. Well, that's what everyone's aspiring to be. And it just kind of increases this likelihood, especially with that level of anonymity, when these checks are difficult to notice who the person is, when there aren't, I guess, checks in place to figure out like this is who's posting. If you ask what I do on Reddit, I lurk a lot on Reddit because I do research on Reddit. It's real easy to figure out who I am on Reddit. You just have to go look at my post history, where I announce who I am and what university I work for and what research
and your email.
I do. No, though you could find my email if you wanted. I always create a separate Gmail for every research project I do.
Right. Well, I mean, it would be in the informed consent on the link.
That's true. Yeah, my university email.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, to an extent. Yeah. So I mean, we're looking at kind of how the internet can kind of create this perfect storm for, in a sense, a mob rule, in the same way that the research on mob influence and conformity is part of this kind of larger group that you can't be identified with.
Mm-hmm.
That kind of takes us to where you want to talk about.
Yeah, so like trolls are fairly individualistic, right? Like they kind of travel in packs, but they don't necessarily all hit the same targets at the same time.
I mean, two trolls on 4chan aren't necessarily going to like each other.
Right, exactly. And so one of the hot topic issues that it's been around for a long time, like let's be honest, but as of late, it's been very central in a lot of discourse. I think it's probably because everybody's been at home because of COVID, and they're realizing how terrible Twitter actually is cancel culture, which I guess, first of all, I don't know if I would say cancel culture is like an entity in of itself, more like an expression of our pre-existing culture on the internet. Because it doesn't seem terribly disconnected from the terrible stuff humans already do in real life.
Yeah, and cancel culture itself, I mean, the idea of banding together, I mean, if we're thinking about it in, I guess, the most basic social sense, the idea of banding together as a social group and saying, we do not approve of your behavior.
Mm-hmm.
Now, whether it's justified, whether it's right,
Mm-hmm.
whether the person being quote unquote canceled is deserving of it,
Mm-hmm.
or maybe they're fighting a larger system and the system's punching back, is a whole nother thing.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, that it's definitely, I can definitely see it as a component of how people generally interact.
Yeah. So, and it kind of gets along with this de-individuation. I know you had a study you wanted to bring up, but one thing that we see with cancel culture is a large swath of anonymous Twitter users are often involved that will dox and post horrible things about an individual that they're all collectively fighting against. Um, and so usually when you have that de-individuation, I know we don't have the actual study, like the authors of the study, but your anime study.
Yeah, we're trying really hard to find it, and apparently finding something from like 6 years ago that was reported, but may not have made it into a publication. It's a whole nother
Mm,
thing. But the UC Berkeley Department of Media Studies put out these findings that basically your avatar can have a lot to do with how seriously you're taken.
mhm.
Though even then, I would almost kind of potentially reject that, because while they might not be taken seriously, if enough people are tweeting about it,
Right. Yeah. If there's one anime avatar yelling at you on Twitter is nothing. But if you have like 200 or 1,000 or more in
it
some
gets you trending.
cases, yeah, you start trending because all these avatars with anime characters are going at you, then I feel like you would probably take that seriously. Um, so yeah, no, cancel culture I feel like is a really groupy de-individuation expression on the internet that's kind of only made possible through that lack of identity. And I think one of the interesting dynamics within it is that, when you get into behavior like this one in particular, that's almost like a threat to have your individual identity revealed while you're participating in cancel culture. And so, like, people take great lengths to make sure that they themselves are protected so the mob doesn't turn on them either.
I mean, it is kind of a benefit for like
Hmm.
de-individuation bolstering this, is that, yeah, you may be more likely to speak out against someone that you perceive to be a threat or you perceive to disagree with, because if you
Hmm.
were confronting them face to face, would you say those same things?
Right.
Would
Yeah.
you
And that's kind of
threaten
like,
their
and it also kind
children?
of depends on the power that the person that you're calling out has to do with as well. So if, because we see cancel culture center around people regardless of their level of institutional power. So you can be a Harvey Weinstein or a Bill Cosby on one hand, but you could also just be like a random YouTuber, like say ContraPoints, or you can be just a random individual who was at the wrong place at the wrong time or didn't have the right opinion online at the wrong time. And so I feel like also kind of the way that we use that de-individuation to call out or to online threaten other people depends on the amount of power that they have, and I guess that also influences the successfulness of a campaign.
Yeah, I mean, there have been a couple of prominent academics in particular who've kind of come out against cancel culture because they
Mm-hmm.
themselves have been the victims of it, and sometimes it's really difficult because these aren't like nobodies in the fields. I can use someone
Right.
like Steven Pinker as an example
Mm-hmm.
of someone recently, or I found out about a case because I had to retweet something on Twitter, and there was this like Skeptic magazine post about, hey, we made this thing for kids to basically understand COVID. It's like a Skeptic Junior, and it's free. And I was like, cool, like free pro sciencey stuff, like great,
Mm-hmm.
like it's kind of up my alley on what few things I'd retweet. And someone responded back with like, "Oh, is Skeptic Magazine still a thing? Like, I thought they went under after like the lead editor was accused of a bunch of sexual misconduct, and I was like, wait, what?
What?
I own 3 of his books. 2 of them are signed. I've met
You're
him at
gonna get canceled now.
I know. I was like, I met him at conferences, and so I went and looked it up, and there are a bunch of accusations, but he's also a fairly prominent individual within kind of that skeptic community. I'm not really sure where I stand. He hasn't blocked me, so
there's that.
There's that. But I don't. Again, there was never like any official suit besides the complaints. But it was one of those things that again, you have someone like him who is there's these accusations. There are people who come out. There were attempts to have him banned from speaking at certain campuses, but also like he and Steven Pinker are kind of doing fine. Steven Pinker is one of the most published researchers like in his field, even in like several subfields that he's a part of. He is massive in kind of his side of the world,
right?
And so was he canceled? Like that line, and that's always what gets me is there's a fine line between what I would say is like cancel culture and criticism. Because in some cases it does seem like we are critical of some of your actions. We would like you to address them, or and there will always be people who are like, you will never address them good enough for us,
right?
Which could cross that line, but there's kind of a difference in that too, especially with that power dynamic, because Steven Pinker being canceled, for lack of a better word, is very different than if someone came after you and me.
Right, yeah. And our universities were like, oop, we don't need that baggage. See ya.
I don't have the grants and publication history to keep me afloat regarding anything.
Right.
If there were something out there,
Has Jonathan Haidt been canceled yet? I feel like he's been canceled.
I'm not entirely sure. I know he's caught a lot of flack. Him and I forget the other guy who runs the was it like the Freedom Under Fire or something like that?
No,
the kind of Free Speech Institute. He actually came and spoke at our campus.
Oh, really?
Pretty interesting.
Yeah.
And nothing too out of the ordinary. But probably to some degree. But again, was that like true canceling, or was it like criticism of some of the stuff that he said, or criticism of claims that he's made? Because there's a real push by Hyatt, and I'm killing myself for not remembering the other guy's name, regarding the amount of free speech restrictions on campuses, and at what point can you say no? Should you just accept everyone? We should have freedom of ideas. So in the same way that we should let anyone come and speak, we should also let's say, like, neo-Nazis come and speak on campuses. And like, at what point do you say no? And because of free speech, because these are publicly funded institutions, they kind of fall in this nebulous area. It's very different than if it were like a private business or a private school.
Oh, but they'd make a fuss about that too.
Well, if we're talking about like absolutist free speech, but if we're talking about reality of free speech, it's just the government can't punish you for speaking. Twitter can tear you apart, and your institution can fire you, and your boss can throw you on the street with no explanation in most states. That there's a big difference there, and again, that's part of where that kind of discussion comes in, I think. And I think we're kind of getting away a little bit from conformity and cancel culture, but these are norms that we create. At what point is it free speech? Like, is it truly free speech to say this over that? Does free speech mean freedom of consequences?
Yeah, and if you go full on everybody's welcome, then you have a problem like the furries do. Right.
And there's that, what is it? It's called the paradox of tolerance.
Yeah.
Where if you tolerate everyone,
and those who are intolerant will take over.
Yeah. And so, again, it's a really good philosophical debate, and it definitely does tie into where you fall in line has a lot to do with your group's norms.
Right. Has anyone been successfully canceled?
Um,
Like, I know, like, people point to someone like Harvey Weinstein, for example, but that dude still has multi-millions of dollars, and he's not going to serve his full prison
and
sentence.
and
So,
that's and that I would argue is not canceling. That's the justice system working like it's supposed to. People commit crimes, they pay for, or they get arrested and tried for those crimes.
hmm
And in this case, it took dozens upon dozens of people, and then we found out that there were articles that were suppressed, years of articles that were suppressed that knew all this was happening. It was an open secret. Cosby's a
hmm
similar thing. Is that really? I wouldn't call that canceling. That
hmm
I mean, there are individuals, and I think cancel culture or canceling takes effect when someone basically leaves the public sphere.
right.
And so you could have, let's say, a YouTuber who gets targeted and they're done. They shut their channel down, they delete their videos, or they
hmm
they don't make any more videos after that. They just say, "No, I'm out. I'm gone." Or maybe you could have a public figure, professor at an institution or something that is, removed without
hmm
severance, without, any sort of settlement, and basically leaves. Um,
I mean, I
and
think the closest might be Kathy Griffin. Although she was able to finally do a successful tour in the United States, but after her beheading Trump photo op, like she couldn't work in the United States anymore, and
well,
she lost
it's
all
like
of
the
her like contracts and stuff. And then
it's
she was
like
also put on the no-fly list too.
it's like the Dixie Chicks 2.0.
Yeah.
And for the younger people in the audience, the Dixie Chicks were a country music band who criticized the Bush administration and their response to 9/11 and the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, and basically lost their entire following. I mean, they're still doing stuff
They're the
to some
chicks
extent.
now.
The Chicks now, yeah. Sure,
Yeah,
don't
no,
want to be
they're
associated
coming
with.
back.
So, like, time can overcome that,
hmm
and it's difficult too because we're also not just talking about, like, because in a capitalist society, I mean, you have the right to decide, I'm not going to watch this person's movies anymore. I'm not going to
hmm
support them. I may have liked them before. Um, it can happen. But that's very different than someone like losing their job. I mean, I think we can say that there have been successful cancelings of people who have maybe said some stuff, maybe out of ignorance,
hmm
and have had an internet outcry and have lost their jobs and their way of life and have had to maybe restart or move. I'll post a video I think would make a good video in the podcast. There's a TED talk on one tweet can ruin your life. It's about this woman who gets on a plane, 13-hour flight to Africa, sends a tweet, and again, this is old school or old school Twitter days. Sends a tweet, going to Africa. Hope I don't get AIDS.
Oh no.
It's pretty bad, but she has a very small group of followers, and they all kind of tweet that kind of dark humor.
Yeah.
It's old
It's like
school
a
Twitter.
closed, yeah, before people were smart enough to close their groups if they were going to tweet about stuff like that.
Right. Well, one of the people in her group had a lot of followers and retweeted it.
Oh no.
And on this 13-hour plane ride where she was not able to defend herself and to kind of apologize, it trended and she lost her job. And there were people who came out and defended and said, like, maybe we should look at her other tweets. Like, this doesn't seem to be, like, maybe we should give her a chance to defend herself. And they were like, well, you're a bigot.
Right.
Too bad. But that was kind of the case. Like, she landed and, you get off the airplane, your phone gets signal again. And it was basically like, you might as well come back because you don't have a job anymore. You don't have to be in Africa. And
Oh
then,
man.
yeah. And that could be an example. I mean, I don't know what she's doing now.
Well, I mean, she got a TED talk.
Well, no, someone got a TED talk about it.
Oh, that sucks. Somebody does a TED talk about you.
Yeah. But kind of
Oh.
talks about her story and talks about the nature of, like, these kind of mob rule on Twitter. And this is
Mhm.
not a new TED talk. I mean, this is an older.
Right.
older one.
Yeah.
but I mean, there may be examples of that, but it's sometimes really hard to tell, because I would even argue that someone like Kathy Griffin or the Dixie Chicks are almost, they're going up against a power structure. You're going up against the president of the United States. You're going up
Right.
against the ruling political party. Is it truly cancel? I mean, because we kind of think of cancel culture as like the mob has decided.
Yeah.
In this case, it may not be. I mean, if you get put on the no-fly list, if the government puts you on the no-fly list as retaliation for speaking out against the president, the government's ruined your life. Like, it's not the mob rule. It's not giving her the opportunity to travel and to kind of make her, you know, her money. Or if you get blacklisted, I mean, we saw this in like with the McCarthy era of,
Right.
you know, blacklisting communists in Hollywood, you know, even if you
Alleged
weren't
communists.
alleged communist, because in a lot of cases it was like, hey, you give me 5 names, you don't get blacklisted. And you're like, all right, here's 5 names. Here's 5 people I don't like in the industry.
Thank you, Ronald Reagan.
Yeah. And, you know, that in a case, maybe some form, but that's also not the mob coming after you. That's the structures and systems of power that are coming after you. And it's I would argue really hard to tell. Like, has someone truly successfully, like outside of like the legal system, and we could argue that like some of these Twitter mobs have like boosted things that maybe we should be talking about if we're talking about Weinstein or Cosby. Maybe, you know, constantly talking about it, keeping it in the news, keeping it trending. But I mean, I look at examples like Louis C.K. He's back to doing
still touring.
He's back to doing comedy after.
He just picked a different demographic.
I mean, you know, who else recently? It's just, there's always someone new, and for the most part, these people are doing okay. They're not going away. But also a lot of the bigger, you know, the people who are able to do this. I would look at like someone like Louis C.K. He's got power. Part of the reason why he got away with doing what he was doing for so long. And if you have no idea and you're listening to this, make sure you Google that with Safe Search.
Yes. Google everything that we say in this podcast with Safe Search. So yeah, no, it looks like, you know, this mob rule cancel culture really only influences smaller people or smaller content creators or people that aren't even like this woman who flew to Africa. Like, she's just a random Twitter user. So really it's the people that don't make a difference. Not to be super pessimistic, but you know, if your fight against anti-bigotry lands you with random Twitter user, maybe your mob got a little misdirected there.
I mean, and ultimately, if we're talking about basic psychology of getting people to change their behaviors, if I'm thinking about doing something as terrible as Louis C.K. did, and putting people in that situation, and I go, oh, maybe should I do this? And I'm like, Louis is doing fine. He got away. Got away with it to an extent. There were no criminal charges. There were no. I mean, there was a period of time off where he was not, doing comedy. But that's not. I don't know. I mean, is that? I guess the question is that the same as being canceled. It makes me think: is there? We're talking about canceling, or are we talking about like a boycott? So I would say someone with the popularity of Louis C.K. that's almost boycotting a celebrity.
I mean, but it kind of, yeah, but even that same behavior could be directed at you. And so because all of us to a certain extent are public figures online, even people who have an account to listen to this, like if you're a listener right now, you have a Google account, and that Google account is tied to some part of who you are, which means you are also publicly visible. And so we are also commodities that are consumed and can be boycotted.
I almost want to make and that's why this podcast is sponsored by NordVPN. But we are not.
It's not NordVPN, it's Wix.
Wix. Raid Shadow Legends. I don't know
The one
how we
I'm
would
getting a
tie
lot
them
right
into
now,
the. We
it's
would.
a what is it? It's a coffee box, like a subscription
Oh,
box for coffee.
not the ones that I'm seeing. It's still it's ExpressVPN and but anyway. But yeah, I mean we're and even then that's not going to protect you from still having your data collected. That's only going to allow you to circumvent some region locking stuff.
I would dread the day that Google like ceases to exist or something, and it's a big data dump,
Oh, it just
like
goes to the
20, 30
highest bidder.
years. Yeah, or like it all just like somebody hacks it and releases it all.
I mean, to an extent, it's happened.
Mm-hmm.
We just had what is it like a million Michigan and Wisconsin voters, Michigan, I think, voters or Minnesota voters had all of their data leaked by a Russian hacking farm.
Oh,
Yep, entire voter like all their information. So basically, we know who they are, and so hey, if you want to target some voters in that state, you now have
where
all
do
their
we
information, and we'll
where do we
target them.
go? WikiLeaks?
No, no. Turns out they were also working with Russian hacking
Mm.
farms. We can't go anywhere.
Oh Lord. So yeah, no, it's just we're on a constant balance beam of, or I guess a seesaw of de-individuation and identification on the internet. Like you can be exposed at any moment, but until you are, enjoy yourself.
Yeah, yeah, and I guess that's that difference between I guess cancel culture and boycotting is that boycotting's the corporation and cancel culture you're
Hmm.
just boycotting a person,
Hmm.
or you're trying to build a movement to. But I was kind
But
of upset. I didn't get around. There was one cancel group that I was kind of looking into. There was a guy online who started putting a list together of all of these like prominent individuals who are anti-American,
oh man.
and it almost became a joke where then people were trying to get on the list.
Oh.
But like everyone, like Chris Evans was on the list
What the,
because he said some stuff disparaging about Donald Trump. It's anti-American. Captain America is now anti-American. He's on the list.
there speaking of like kind of pulling it back to our marketplace of ideas and like minimal YouTubers and cancel culture, there is something that's going on right now in like a little circle that I look at, which is in like the leftist commentary. And there's this phenomenon where people are calling out class reductionists. Are you familiar?
No,
Okay, so
I,
class
I
reductionists.
understand the term to some extent, but you're
Yeah,
definitely gonna have to
so
explain it.
basically a class reductionist in this sense is someone who says there's an upper class and there's the lower class, and uh, racial gender distinctions are not important in the class struggle, which there are people that believe that. But it's also very much a witch hunty title as well. And so this one particular YouTuber who does, I think he does Twitch streaming, um, has started listing off people that he thinks are class reductionists, that are smaller YouTubers than himself, that are critical of him, and sending his fans over to spam and dox those YouTubers and to try to get them off of the like YouTube. And then he's like, if you don't think you're a class reductionist, come onto my channel and debate me. And so there's also this like very heavy and like when those YouTubers respond with the video, like that increases engagement and attention on him. So he ends up making money both by doing just the call out, but then also by luring people in to debate him.
And because he's predominantly focusing on people who have less
Hmm.
subscribers than he does, it's almost a and it's a power thing. I mean,
Right.
we're talking about kind of cancel culture in action where the powerful can cancel the less powerful.
But he is also like niche YouTuber too. So if somebody like larger than him wants to eat him, that's totally on the table. So he is both
Yeah,
at threat and threatening at the same time.
that's interesting. But again, like it, yeah. But I'd wonder too. I mean, this would be such a niche study, you know. is there something about like that kind of person who like understands like they can be a victim too? And usually when they are, it's very much this surprised moment. Like, I didn't realize I could.
Mm-hmm.
I've been canceling people for years. I didn't realize I could also be canceled.
Right.
Um, that doing it. I mean, but we kind of see that as well with like the trolling behaviors and bullying behaviors and things like that of that dishing it out, but not necessarily taking, or at least not contemplating that you might be the victim one day.
Right, exactly. Because it just takes one person to point out that you aren't the archetypical holier than thou person for it to all turn around on you.
And just as an aside, this reminds me that I should bring up our bias of the podcast.
Yes, bias. What's the bias of the week?
It's very fitting to de-individuation and attempts to say mean things to people online or to cancel certain people online. Restraint bias.
Oh.
Nordgren, Van Harveld, and Van der Plig. I'm probably saying that last name, that last one right. Pligt. Van der Pleit. Van der Pleit. Pleit. I think it's like plight, like flight.
Oh, okay.
2009. It's the tendency to overestimate one's capacity for impulse control.
Oh.
So I'm totally going to control what I say online. I will have to say that I might overestimate my ability, but after this is my 10th year teaching, like sitting up in front of a classroom and having worked retail in overlapping 10 years prior to that, it was about 7 years and then concurrently when I started teaching, I'm fairly good at holding my tongue, my impulse control, and there are some things that pop into my head that I'm like, wait, I'm not going to say this. Especially on the internet, with very few exceptions. I don't think I've ever regretted a tweet that I've made, and I say very few. There's like one or two, and it wasn't the content; it was the response that I regretted.
Right.
And then like Reddit posts and things like that, because I'm more than just an anonymous. I do not have my face as my avatar. I have Marvel Comics' evil robot Sigmund Freud as my avatar, which you can only find like 2 pictures of on the internet. Because I've really tried to find a better one. But they, that being in front of a classroom for so often, especially like my first teaching job working at, kind of rural southern Louisiana university and going, I'm totally going to lecture on this gender and sexuality chapter in my Psych 101 class.
See, that's kind of like why I need to be careful, because I started out teaching death and dying and human sexuality, and so like most of my public speaking is stepping on people's toes. Like I've actually had like not students, but like in conferences, like I've made professors mad at me for the research that I was doing and like directly yell at me. I think that was my first conference I ever attended. I got yelled at. So like I'm pretty liberated and my lips are pretty loose.
I kind of started on the flip side of that, but yeah, that I am becoming more what I think the lines I'm willing to kind of cross into some topics in like a standard class. Though I have had a couple of moments where like I thought like, oh, this is not going to be a controversial thing to say. And then I had someone say something. I was like, I did not expect that from a student in the class. I did not expect pushback from that almost non-confrontational comment, or at least what I thought when I perceived that I would even perceive in like a Southern Louisiana university would also be a particularly non-controversial thing.
One thing I like to do, at least this is what I did with my sex class, whenever we came across something confrontational, this is probably poor of me, but I usually initiated a debate between the class. So we were talking about gender and dating and something like that. And then the students started getting, like, the male students were getting triggered about women dating, and the women students were getting triggered about men dating, and they all wanted to, like, direct it at me. And I was like, you know what? We're going to direct it at each other, and I'll moderate. How about that? So that way I'm not saying anything, but I can cut you off if you're being rude.
Yeah, that happened. I did the social psychology class last semester, and it was kind of a debate structure where we'd have a controversy every week that we would cover, and sometimes it went better than others. I think there was definitely maybe a fear of interaction, so there wasn't as much debate. Yeah, it was. I mean, it was fun to an extent. There were a couple of moments that got a little tense. But yeah, like it kind of breaks out of that structure of like saying, wait. Let's talk about it as a group. And you can do it. There's a lot that I've learned, especially when we're talking about proper behavior or appropriate social behavior outside of, even on the internet, of like agreements for dialogue. And so like, hey, we're talking as a class, but when we talk, like we are not making generalized comments about other groups. We are speaking for ourselves, not our group. And so if I say something about someone, it's me. It's not like you shouldn't, bash my group because of it. I also try to keep a kind of a quasi Fight Club policy in my classes when we talk about sensitive stuff, because I want them to be open.
Right.
And, you shouldn't have to necessarily worry about what you're going to say. You should be able to have some freedom. You might get challenged for it, and that does sometimes mean that some stuff gets said in class that I'm like, maybe we need to back up from this.
Let's back up. Let's take a holistic view of what's going on here.
Sometimes I'm the cause of it, because I see someone, I'm like, you want to say something? You seem to want to, and they're like, okay, fine, I'll say it, and I'm like, oh, okay.
Oh, maybe. Lord. You empowered them.
Right.
Their social inhibition was working, and you undermined it.
Right. But also, like, I would like that in the class. I mean,
right.
Maybe for a graduate, or if I were teaching like death and dying, or like human sexuality.
It's really useful for human sexuality, especially to break that down, because people don't know anything, but they're all very confident about the things they don't know.
Overconfidence bias. We could throw that one in there.
Yeah. So having them expose that, and then maybe I'll say, okay, that I understand why you feel that way. Here's why it's not that way.
It was still one of the best classes I had as an undergrad. We had that, and again, thinking about conformity, in terms of that, the teacher who taught that, he was the head of the department, wrote one of the major textbooks on it, Bruce King, and would talk in class, like when he was talking about things like gender and masculinity and femininity, would wear his pink shirt.
Nice.
And said that there are people he has been working in that department with for a decade who are still uncomfortable when he wears his pink shirt, and he hugs them every time he wears his pink shirt.
Before I even talk about gender or gender nonconformity and stuff like that, I make everybody go around and look at their own appearance and go, what about what you're wearing right now is not in line with your gender? And everybody always has something to say. And I'm like, great, we're all precocious right now.
Nice.
Now let's stretch it.
And yeah, so I guess I could kind of lead us back into the internet.
We're distracted today.
Yeah. But yeah, I mean that's still, and there's an argument of how that ties into conformity. In these cases, conformity in which we are definitely ourselves. We are us and identified as such, and not, able to hide behind some screen or avatar, or something like that, some username, as opposed to, I think I'm getting to a point that with my original Reddit account, my YouTube account, which I'm using for this, my original YouTube account, which I'm using for this, which I have privatized all my old videos, my two, that yeah, that I no longer have a handle online. It's the same. It is me. It is one and the same of who I am.
Mm-hmm.
And and I would maybe argue that it's been a good thing for me.
Mm-hmm.
I have definitely not put myself in situations online willingly. There's that one time
You're
um,
right.
that and I guess I could talk about that one time real quick. We could end on that note that even if you don't plan to, even if that you're identified. So I mean, I'm identified as Daniel Chadbourne on Twitter, even though that's not my at. That so I got involved. It's been like 2 years since I've been back on Twitter. I took like a year off, and it was mostly after this, just because I was like, I don't need to waste I can waste my time enough on Reddit. I don't need to waste my time on Twitter. Um, I have other things I can waste my time on. That there was this big issue going on with this anime voice actor, and there were some allegations that had come out, some potentially inappropriate behavior. This was kind of I don't want to say the height of Me Too, but it was part of that kind of Me Too-esque movement. And he was fighting back. He was trying to sue some of the other people who had made allegations for like defamation. He was trying to sue the company, who basically said like, I don't know, this seems kind of credible. We don't want to work with you anymore. There were, some people that I were following on YouTube, some lawyers and other people. I tend to follow journalists, lawyers, other things, just because I'm interested in some of that stuff, especially like pop culture law, copyright law. And so they were talking about it. There were some people that I had been following for years who were talking about it. Some like old YouTubers, some old like internet personalities that I had watched when I was in college, early college, that I was following, and I was kind of getting bits and pieces, but mostly what I had seen was some discussion of like people receiving death threats. So some of the people who were talking about this voice actor, some of the people who were talking about the followers and supporters of this voice actor, basically sending them death threats.
Mm-hmm.
And so I was like, hey, I'm a psychologist online. I've got that PhD behind my name now. Why don't I use, like why don't I talk about the psychology of some of this stuff? And so I think I did about 7 or 8 tweets in a row. It's like a chain.
Mm-hmm.
In reality, barely anyone reads anyway. And it was basically of like, this is how death threats work. That there's this concept of deindividuation that can increase the likelihood of following norms. There's cognitive dissonance that can increase rationalization. This person is against my group. This person is less than me. This person deserves it. It may make me feel okay engaging in that behavior. So I kind of threw out a couple of psych terms. And then I went to bed because I didn't think it was anything important. Who's gonna, the 100 people who follow me on Twitter, who's gonna see it? And so I woke up the next morning and I didn't check my phone. I got to work. I sat down at my desk. I opened up my phone before class and I went, why do I have like 50 notes on Twitter? Like, why do I have responses?
Oh no.
Well, one of those people who are getting the death threats co-follows me, which I felt kind of like, this was someone that I watched some of their early internet videos, and I was like, oh, that's nice. Well, they retweeted it.
Oh no.
And the anime
That's
voice
my
actor,
retweet.
the anime voice actor fans thought that I was attacking them.
Oh.
They took it as a hit, that I was specifically calling out like them as a group. Now, I think I did mention in part of those tweets that, like, let's say, for example, because I mean, this was the actual case that spurned it. There was a fan. It's kind of like a not all hashtag not all men. I'm like, well, I'm not talking about all of these supporters. I'm not talking about this voice actor being right or wrong or a predator or not. I'm talking about this person sending a death threat, which, in my mind, I don't care who you are. how can you defend that?
Right.
Well, how naive I was.
Oh no.
It wasn't really a defense of that. It was more of, you're getting into things you don't understand. You need to watch yourself or you're going to lose your job. And I was like, no, I'm not.
No, no.
I'm like, do you really think? Because that's what made me think of the anime avatar thing. It's like, do you really think the president of my university is going to go, wait, you tweeted about why death threats are wrong, and this guy with an anime avatar is trying to get you fired? I mean, it's possible. I have
Right.
relatively little power as a new faculty member,
And
and
thankfully he
so,
was alone and not working with a group of people who were trying to get you fired.
well, definitely was, or
Oh.
potentially was, because there were a group of people. It
Uh-huh.
apparently got on some other lawyers. Like, apparently I'm on some YouTube channel. I don't know. I haven't watched it. But what I found, kind of the two most fascinating things I found about this, is that one, I did actually engage with one of them. So a lot of them, I just said, nope, and I blocked them because of the things that they said. There was someone who was kind of taking a fine line, and I said, hey, like, I'm not claiming, like, I'll go and read up on this guy. I'll go and read up on the case. I'll go and try to understand more. The more and more I read up on it, it didn't necessarily help the guy's case, at least in my perspective. But also, like, again, there was no conviction. There were no charges. And his lawsuit got dropped. His defamation lawsuits got dropped. That I was like, look, like, I'm not calling out him. I'm calling out virulent supporters who send death threats to people, and trying to explain the processes. I had people who, I'm gonna guess, have nothing better to do than sit on Twitter all day, telling me that I didn't understand psychology. I had, and
Of course.
I mean, depends on what we're talking about. There's a lot I don't understand. That, but yeah, it was this really kind of eye opening moment of like there's suddenly a bunch of people who are upset, and I think they missed the point.
Mm-hmm.
And I wasn't trying to attack them. And there were a couple, like, again, the one guy I engage with, I'll give him a lot of respect because, again, we can disagree on a lot. And there's a lot that he would tweet about that I would disagree on, that, but we can agree that, like, yeah, like, it's unacceptable for people, to send these death threats. And we talked a little bit, and basically what I learned from him and what I learned from this case as well, and this was the other eye-opening moment, is that what was also interesting is that while some people kind of jumped on me for making some of these statements because they felt it was an attack, there was this general perspective amongst kind of the core group of people who were involved in this, that my statements were because I was being misinformed by that other person I followed.
Mm.
And that she had manipulated me in some way. And I'll say she because I think that has something to do with it.
Right.
That me as kind of an academic with maybe some level of power, some level of authority on maybe some of the stuff that I was talking about, may have been like prompted or coerced in some way to doing that.
Mm-hmm.
And because I mutually followed that other person, I actually had a conversation with them as well. And they were like, they kind of, I was like, one, you don't have to apologize. Like, I tweet and I stand by my tweets. I'm going to go now continue to tweet about less controversial things like bronies and furries. And maybe take a break from Twitter for a little while. But it was a really interesting concept. It was nerve-wracking. It was just like, I have to deal with this. And I might have to deal with this in more case if these people continued to get upset. But it was kind of interesting, though, that it ended very quickly, for me at least. It definitely continued for a lot of other people involved, other voice actors and actresses, other prominent people who are constantly kind of speaking out against the behavior or bringing up past events and past stories and accounts and things like that. And then for the voice actor himself, and then the stuff that was going on between everyone, that but it was also really eye opening that like in the end I was just I wasn't the real threat.
Mhm.
I was this duped into picking a side, even though I didn't really see myself picking a side with what I tweeted by the other side kind of
Mhm.
running things. And really it was just that one side that was making that kind of call and accusation, that there wasn't anyone making accusations against the voice actor who sent me any harmful messages, who um said anything harmful, who had anything negative or critique wise based on what I said, because they didn't see it as a threat. They didn't. Their group didn't view that as, they were like, yeah, like we're sitting here ranting about why we're getting doxxed and we're getting
Mhm.
death threats. Like, of course we agree with this. But it
Hmm.
was my foray into cancel culture.
Yeah, you got tangentially roped in.
And even though I would argue I didn't, there was no prior communication with me and the people involved. It was just me kind of seeing people tweeting and going like, death threats are bad.
Mhm.
Why would someone send death threats? Like, well, let me think of what really basic Psych 101 concepts would explain this, and then kind of throwing it out there. And so,
Mhm. Well, like that's kind of one of the aspects of cancel culture, though. If you look at ContraPoints did a video that kind of dissected cancel culture and her experience with it,
we'll have to
and
add it.
somebody, yeah, we'll add that. This one's actually really good because it actually like goes through step by step how it goes. And one of the things that had happened was that people who were tangentially related to her, who may or may not have been in a video or like it was public knowledge that they were friends, um, those people would also get doxxed and demands to renounce their friendship or apologize for associating with this person, even though that other person had nothing to do with what ContraPoints was being canceled over. And so, like, you just have to be within, spot range of an event in order to get wrapped up into it.
Yeah. I mean, you have to follow the right person or the wrong person in this case.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that it's so. I mean, again, it's kind of fascinating, but part of that, and I think she explains that in her video, is that it's to isolate you.
Mm-hmm.
It's to give you no support, and so the idea is that you break the person down. And it's not always about a real reason to cancel that person.
Mm-hmm.
Would me tweeting about why death threats are wrong justifiably be a reason to call for my job?
No, but
No.
it's enough to scare you from tweeting about it again to give that other
Right.
person the feeling of solidarity.
Right. And that feeling of superiority,
Mm-hmm.
power. And maybe that's what it kind of boils down to, that if you don't have the power, maybe you try to find it wherever you can get it.
You're either a Karen at Walmart or you're a Karen on Twitter.
Or you're stuck in the middle,
Stuck in the middle. It's
being a
Facebook.
lurker who has to work retail. So yeah, I think this is a good stopping point.
Yeah, I think so.
I think there's a lot more to potentially unpack here, but we're already on episode 3.
Right. Yeah, no, I think we need to get out of conformity and switch it up a bit.
Yeah. So the next 3 chapters, and we may not do them in order pending some current events and availability of some potential special guests, are attraction, aggression, and prosocial behavior. Or attraction, prosocial behavior, and aggression. I think that's the correct order.
But we're going to mix it up.
Yeah, so we'll be talking about one of those next time. And yeah, so until then, goodbye.
Talk to y'all later.